The air in the mansion was thick with tension as Henry stood in the grand living room, his face a mask of controlled fury. Clara descended the staircase, her polished demeanor betraying no hint of remorse. She carried herself with the air of someone who believed they could talk their way out of anything. But Henry was resolute, there would be no escape this time. Clara stopped mid-step when she saw the hard set of Henry's jaw and the glare in his eyes. "What's the matter?" she asked lightly, feigning ignorance. "You look upset." Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath and held up his phone. "I know what you've been doing, Clara. I've seen it all." Her brows furrowed briefly, then her lips curled into a weary smile. "Seen what? What are you talking about?" Henry's thumb swiped across his phone screen, and the damning footage played on the TV mounted on the wall. Clara's voice echoed through the room, sharp and venomous as she berated Lorna. The scenes of physical abuse and manipulation unfolded in brutal clarity. Clara's smile vanished, replaced by a pale expression of disbelief. "What is this?" she asked, her voice faltering. "This is the truth," Henry said coldly. "I had cameras installed because I suspected something was wrong. And now I see just how wrong it is." Clara's initial shock gave way to indignation. "You installed cameras in our home? Without telling me? That's an invasion of privacy." Henry's voice rose, his anger finally breaking through. "Privacy? You're worried about privacy after what you've done to Lorna. She's pregnant with our child, Clara. And you've been treating her like a slave, no, worse than that. You burned her with a hot iron." Clara crossed her arms defensively, her voice sharpening. "And what was I supposed to do, Henry? Just let her waltz around here, acting like she's part of this family? She's nothing but a glorified babysitter for your precious heir." Henry's hands balled into fists at his sides. "She's a human being, Clara. She's been carrying the child we've been waiting for, sacrificing her own life to give us what we wanted. And you've repaid her with cruelty and hatred." Clara's gaze hardened. "You're being dramatic. She's not some saint, Henry. Don't let her meek act fool you. She knows exactly what she's doing, worming her way into your good graces, stealing your attention from me." Henry took a step closer, his voice quieter but more cutting. "This isn't about attention, Clara. This is about decency. Humanity. And you've shown neither." Clara's face twisted with anger. "You're taking her side, aren't you? Over me, your wife. Do you even hear yourself?" Henry's tone grew cold. "I'm taking the side of what's right. And if you can't see that, then maybe you're not the woman I thought I married." The words hit Clara like a slap. Her bravado faltered, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shaken. "You can't mean that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I do," Henry said firmly. "I've tried to reason with you, tried to make this work. But your jealousy and cruelty have gone too far. If you can't change, Clara, then we have no future together." Clara's shock quickly morphed into anger again. "So that's it? You're throwing away our marriage because of her? Because of some girl who doesn't even belong here?" Henry shook his head. "I'm ending this because of you, Clara. Your actions, your choices. I've given you every chance to do better, but you've only made things worse." Clara's eyes burned with fury as she took a step closer. "You think you can just walk away? Fine. But don't think for a second that you'll take everything with you. This house, your precious child, even your reputation, I'll make sure you lose it all." Henry stared at her, unflinching. "You can try, Clara. But I won't let you hurt anyone else in the process." With that, he turned and left the room, leaving Clara standing alone, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. Upstairs, Lorna sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling as she cradled her swollen belly. The muffled sound of voices from downstairs reached her ears, but she couldn't make out the words. Her mind raced with fears of what might happen next. A soft knock at her door startled her, and she quickly wiped her tears. "Come in," she said hesitantly. The door opened, and Henry stepped inside, his expression gentle but somber. "Lorna," he said softly, sitting down beside her. "It's over." "I confronted Clara. She won't hurt you anymore." Lorna's eyes welled up with tears. "What did she say?" Henry hesitated, his face clouded with sadness. "She doesn't see what she's done wrong. And I don't think she ever will." Lorna lowered her gaze, unsure of how to respond. "But I promise you this," Henry continued, his voice firm. "I'll protect you and the baby, no matter what. You don't have to live in fear anymore." Lorna nodded, her tears falling freely now. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt a glimmer of hope. As Henry stood to leave, he paused at the door. "You're not alone in this, Lorna. Not anymore." And with those words, the tide began to turn in Lorna's life. The sun peeked through the heavy drapes of Lorna's room, but she didn't stir. She sat motionless on the edge of her bed, staring at the wall. Her hands rested protectively over her belly, but her mind was far away, drowning in a sea of hopelessness. The confrontation between Henry and Clara the previous night replayed in her mind. She had overheard enough to know that Clara's disdain for her had deepened, and though Henry's words offered some comfort, they couldn't erase the months of humiliation and pain she had endured. Lorna's breaking point wasn't one moment but an accumulation of countless ones, the snide remarks, the physical blows, the lonely nights spent wondering how she had ended up in this nightmare. Her strength had kept her silent for so long, but now, that strength was fraying. A knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. "Lorna?" It was Henry's voice, soft and hesitant. "Come in," she replied, her voice hoarse from hours of crying. Henry entered, his eyes immediately falling on her pale face and weary expression. He sat down across from her, concern etched into every line of his face. "How are you feeling today?" he asked gently. Lorna hesitated. She didn't want to burden him with her feelings, but she couldn't keep it bottled up anymore. "Henry," she began, her voice trembling, I don't think I can do this anymore." His brow furrowed in alarm. "What do you mean?" This life," she said, gesturing around the room. "Carrying this baby, living under Clara's shadow, feeling like I'm just something everyone can use and throw away. It's too much." Henry leaned forward, his expression softening. "Lorna, I know things have been unimaginably hard for you, and I take responsibility for not seeing it sooner. But you don't have to go through this alone anymore. I'm here, and I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." Lorna shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "You can't fix this, Henry. Every time I look in the mirror, I see someone I don't recognize anymore. I've lost who I am." Henry's heart ached at her words. He reached out, placing a comforting hand on hers. You're stronger than you realize, Lorna. What you've been through would break most people, but you're still standing. She pulled her hand away, her voice rising in anguish. For how much longer? Clara hates me. The people in this house look at me like I don't belong. And I'm carrying a child I never asked for. Tell me, Henry, what part of this is worth enduring? Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Henry didn't have an immediate answer. He couldn't undo the mistakes that had brought her to this point, but he knew he couldn't let her give up now. I can't change the past, he said finally, his voice firm yet kind. But I can give you a future that's different, the future where you're safe, respected, and loved. You don't have to stay here if it's too painful. I'll find somewhere for you to heal, somewhere you can feel free. Lorna looked at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. You'd do that for me? I'd do anything to see you happy, he said simply. You and the baby are my responsibility, and I won't fail you again. The room fell into silence, save for the quiet hum of the house around them. Lorna's resolve wavered as she processed his words. She wanted to believe him, to trust that there was still hope for her future, but her doubts lingered. Finally, she spoke. If I leave, Clara will win. She'll see it as proof that I wasn't strong enough to stand my ground. Henry nodded, understanding her fear. Then stay. But stay for you, not for her. Stay because you deserve a chance to rebuild your life, not because you need to prove anything to anyone. His words resonated deeply within her. For so long, she had lived as if she had to justify her existence, to prove her worth to those who doubted her. Maybe it was time to live for herself. I'll try, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I don't know how much more I can take. Henry squeezed her hand gently. You're not alone anymore, Lorna. Whatever happens, I'll be here to support you. And Clara, she won't hurt you again. I promise. Later that evening, Lorna sat by the window in her room, gazing out at the sprawling gardens below. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a life beyond the confines of the mansion, a life where she could raise her child in peace, where she could reclaim her identity and her dreams. But her hope was fragile, like a delicate flame threatened by the winds of her fears. And as she rested her hand on her belly, she couldn't help but wonder if the worst was yet to come. The morning light filtered through the mansion's tall windows, casting long shadows across the marble floors. The house was unusually quiet, the tension from the previous night lingering like a heavy fog. Clara sat on the edge of the bed in the master suite, her suitcase half-packed and her face a storm of conflicting emotions. She hadn't slept. The confrontation with Henry played in her mind on an endless loop, his harsh words cutting through her pride like a knife. Your jealousy and cruelty have gone too far. If you can't change, then we have no future together. She scoffed bitterly, though tears threatened to spill. Downstairs, Henry paced the living room, his decision weighing heavily on him. He had hoped Clara might show some remorse, some flicker of the woman he had once loved, but instead, her defiance and lack of accountability solidified his resolve. He had already called a lawyer and had the staff prepare Clara's belongings. Today, she would leave. Clara descended the staircase with slow, deliberate steps, her suitcase rolling behind her. She was dressed impeccably, as if to preserve the illusion of control, but her face betrayed her inner turmoil. Henry stood waiting, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. You're really doing this? Clara asked, her voice tinged with bitterness. Henry nodded. I've given you every opportunity to make this right, Clara. Instead, you've made it clear that you care more about your pride than the people around you. This is the only way forward. Clara scoffed, her lips curling into a mocking smile. Forward? You think kicking me out of my own house is moving forward? Don't fool yourself, Henry. This is your loss, not mine. Henry's gaze hardened. This isn't just my house, Clara. And it hasn't felt like a home in a long time, not with the way you've been acting. You've left me no choice. Clara's eyes flashed with anger. And what about her? The little saint upstairs. Let me guess, you're planning to play house with her now. A perfect little family with her carrying your child? Henry's jaw tightened, but he refused to be baited. This isn't about Lorna. This is about you and the choices you've made. You could have been part of this family, but instead, you chose to destroy it. Clara's grip on her suitcase handle tightened, her knuckles white. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, Henry. When I'm gone, you'll realize what you've lost. He sighed, his expression softening slightly. I lost you a long time ago, Clara. The person you are now. I don't recognize her. For a moment, Clara's mask of anger faltered. Her lips quivered, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. But just as quickly, she straightened her posture, her pride forcing her to maintain the facade. Fine, she said coldly. If this is what you want, then so be it. But don't expect me to go quietly. Henry didn't respond. He simply stepped aside as Clara stormed past him, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. At the front door, she turned for one last parting shot. You'll regret this, Henry, she said, her voice low and menacing. Mark my words. With that, she flung open the door and disappeared into the waiting car, her suitcase in tow. The silence that followed her departure was deafening. Henry stood in the empty foyer, his shoulders slumping as the weight of the confrontation settled over him. Despite everything, he felt a pang of sadness. Clara had once been the love of his life, and letting her go was not a decision he had made lightly. Lorna watched from the top of the staircase, her heart heavy with mixed emotions. She had heard snippets of the argument, the sound of Clara's voice laced with venom and anger, and she had felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't asked for any of this, for the pregnancy, for the mansion, for the destruction of Henry and Clara's marriage. Henry noticed her standing there and gave her a faint smile, though his exhaustion was evident. It's over, he said simply. Lorna descended the stairs cautiously. I'm sorry, she said softly. I never wanted to cause trouble between you and Clara. Henry shook his head. This isn't your fault, Lorna. Clara made her choices, and now we all have to live with the consequences. Lorna nodded, though a part of her still felt the weight of the situation. What happens now? She asked tentatively. Henry sighed. Now, we move forward. One step at a time. That evening, the atmosphere in the mansion was different. Without Clara's presence, there was a sense of calm that hadn't been there before. The staff, who had often walked on eggshells around her, seemed more relaxed. Lorna, too, felt a small sense of relief, though the uncertainty of the future still loomed. As Henry sat alone in his study, staring out at the sprawling gardens, he thought about everything that had led to this moment. Clara's departure was the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he resolved to face it with strength and determination, for Lorna, for the child she carried, and for the life they were all trying to rebuild. The mansion was quieter than it had ever been, the echo of Clara's presence finally fading from its walls. Henry had ensured that the transition was smooth, giving Clara everything she needed to live without disrupting Lorna's fragile state. Yet, the weight of recent events lingered in the air. Lorna sat by the large window in her new room, a soft breeze rustling the curtains. It was a sunny morning, the golden light streaming in and warming the space. For the first time, she felt a sense of calm, a fragile but welcome reprieve from the chaos that had engulfed her life. The events of the past few days replayed in her mind, the confrontation, the departure of Clara, and Henry's unwavering support. She hadn't expected him to take such drastic action, especially when it meant ending his marriage. But his kindness and determination to protect her had surprised her, leaving her both grateful and uncertain about the future. A gentle knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly. Henry stepped in, carrying a tray with breakfast. "Good morning," he said with a warm smile. "I thought you could use a proper meal to start the day." Lorna's eyes widened in surprise. "You didn't have to do that, Henry." The staff can wait," he interrupted gently. "This is something I wanted to do." She smiled shyly as he placed the tray on the small table by the window. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "How are you feeling today?" Lorna hesitated, her hands resting on her growing belly. "Better," she admitted. "It feels different now. Like I can finally breathe." Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly how it should feel. You've been through so much, Lorna. But I promise, from now on, things will be different." They ate in comfortable silence for a moment, the clinking of silverware the only sound in the room. Finally, Henry spoke again. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone careful. "About what happens next." Lorna looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You deserve a fresh start. Somewhere far from the shadows of everything that's happened here. I want to make sure you and the baby have everything you need to live a happy, peaceful life." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You mean, you want me to leave?" "No," Henry said quickly, shaking his head. "I would never force you to leave. But I want you to have options. Freedom to choose what's best for you and the baby." Lorna's gaze dropped to her hands. "I don't know what's best," she admitted. "My life has been one storm after another. I've never had the chance to think about what I want." Henry reached across the table, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Then let's figure it out together. You're not alone in this, Lorna. You have me. And I'll support whatever decision you make." Tears welled up in her eyes, but this time, they were tears of gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered. The following weeks were a period of transition for both Henry and Lorna. With Clara gone, the mansion felt lighter, almost peaceful. Lorna began to settle into her new life, finding small joys in the quiet moments. Henry, true to his word, ensured that Lorna's needs were met. He arranged for prenatal care, hired a gentle and understanding nurse to assist her, and even brought in a counselor to help her process everything she'd been through. But as they spent more time together, a subtle shift began to take place. What had started as a bond of necessity and protection grew into something deeper. Henry found himself drawn to Lorna's quiet strength, her resilience, and her kind heart. And Lorna, despite her initial reservations, began to see Henry in a new light, not just as a protector, but as someone who genuinely cared for her well-being. One evening, as they sat on the back patio watching the sunset, Henry turned to her. "Lorna," he began, his voice tentative, "I know this isn't the life you imagined for yourself. And I know I've made mistakes along the way. But I want you to know how much I admire your strength." She looked at him, her expression softening. "I wouldn't have made it this far without your support, Henry." He hesitated, then took her hand in his. "I want you to know that no matter what happens, you'll always have a place here. With me. Not just because of the baby, but because you matter, Lorna." Her breath caught at his words, a mix of emotions swirling within her. Gratitude, hope, and something she hadn't felt in a long time, happiness. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that this could truly be the start of a new chapter. One filled with possibilities, healing, and perhaps even love. The days following Clara's departure were a whirlwind of change for Lorna. The mansion, once oppressive and full of tension, now felt like a completely different place. The housemaids, who had once walked on eggshells in fear of Clara, were now warm and accommodating, offering Lorna their kindness and support. Henry, too, had become more attentive. He spent more time at home, making sure Lorna was comfortable and cared for. He had arranged for a private doctor to visit regularly, ensuring the pregnancy was progressing smoothly. The gestures were small at first, a cup of herbal tea placed gently on her bedside table, the comforting word when she seemed overwhelmed, but they gradually grew into something deeper. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink, Henry found Lorna sitting in the garden. She was on a wooden bench beneath a flowering magnolia tree, her hands gently resting on her growing belly. She looked serene, yet there was a wistfulness in her eyes. "May I join you?" Henry asked, his voice soft. Lorna glanced up and smiled faintly. "Of course." He sat beside her, leaving enough space to ensure she felt comfortable. For a moment, they were silent, the sound of birds chirping and the gentle rustle of leaves filling the air. "How are you feeling today?" Henry finally asked, breaking the silence. Lorna shrugged slightly. "Better, I think. It's peaceful here now. Almost strange." Henry chuckled softly. "It is strange. I didn't realize how much tension Clara brought into this house until she was gone." Lorna lowered her gaze, unsure of how to respond. She still felt guilty about the part she had played in the unraveling of Henry's marriage, even though none of it had been her fault. Henry seemed to sense her unease. "Lorna," he said gently, "I know you've been through so much, far more than anyone your age should ever have to endure. I want you to know that none of this is your fault." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "Sometimes, it feels like everything is my fault. That I've caused so much pain for everyone around me." Henry shook his head. "You didn't ask for any of this. What happened to you at the hospital was a terrible mistake, and the way Clara treated you was inexcusable. But through it all, you've been strong. And now, you're giving life to a child who will be loved and cherished. That's something beautiful, Lorna, not something to feel guilty about." His words touched her deeply, and for the first time, she allowed herself to smile, a genuine, heartfelt smile. "Thank you," she whispered. They fell into an easy conversation, talking about everything and nothing at the same time. Henry shared stories from his childhood, and Lorna found herself laughing at his tales of mischief. For the first time in months, she felt at ease, as though the weight she had been carrying was starting to lift. As the evening deepened, Henry hesitated before speaking again. "Lorna, I've been thinking about the future." She looked at him, her expression curious. "This baby," he said slowly, "means everything to me. But I also want to make sure you're happy, that you feel safe and cared for. You've already given so much, and I don't want you to feel like you're just an obligation." Lorna frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Henry took a deep breath, his gaze earnest. "I mean that I care about you, Lorna. More than I ever expected to. You've brought light back into this house, into my life. And I don't just see you as the mother of my child, I see you as someone I deeply admire." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away, unsure of how to process his words. I don't know what to say," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything now," Henry assured her. "I just wanted you to know how I feel. And that I'll never pressure you into anything. Your happiness is just as important to me as the baby's." Lorna nodded, her heart pounding. She had never imagined that someone like Henry, wealthy, kind, and gentle, could see her in such a light. For so long, she had felt like an outsider, unworthy of love or attention. But now, for the first time, she allowed herself to hope. As they sat together beneath the magnolia tree, the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The bond between them, once born of circumstance, was slowly transforming into something deeper, something more profound. In that quiet, starlit moment, Lorna realized that she wasn't alone anymore. And though the path ahead was still uncertain, she knew she could face it with Henry by her side.